The clock on the wall of capacitor housed two red 4 hours, 51 minutes, and it was not Earth's clock. It belonged to the ships in high orbit, and Earth was only allowed to watch it because the fleet wanted her to. Specialist Reya Boone kept her eyes on the number anyway, the way you keep your eyes on a dog that hasn't decided yet whether to bite. Behind her, the capacitor banks breathed their low mechanical hum, 4 stories of copper and coolant buried under 600 feet of Ashford Ridge granite. Somewhere above that granite, a fleet of 900 imperial hulls sat in a deceleration curve so precise it looked, on the tactical board, like a single held breath. "They're broadcasting it on every band we own," said Corporal Owen Ake, hunched over the comms table with a headset crushing his curls flat. "Clean signal, no encryption. They want us counting along." "Let them," Reya said. She did not look away from the number, 4 hours, 50 minutes. It ticked down in a font that was too elegant for what it meant. 600 kilometers above the ridge, on the command deck of a warship called the Unbroken, Fleet Admiral Kallavan set down his stylus and regarded the 200 officers arrayed in the amphitheater of his briefing hall as though they were a problem he had already solved. In front of him hung a schematic of a continent he had never walked on, seamed with red projection lines that converged, all of them, on a modest fold of mountains that imperial cartography had labeled, with characteristic indifference, designated Terrain Feature 4. "Totality in 5 hours, Kallavan said. His voice carried without effort. It was a voice that had said this sentence in one form or another over 3,000 times on 3,000 worlds, and had been right on all 3,000 occasions. Orbital suppression concludes at hour 1. Ground elements secure the primary defense structure by hour 3. Mopping and garrison installation by hour 5. This is the standard reclamation model, executed as written. I do not expect deviation." A junior officer near the back of the hall, a Threndeli adjutant named Sarai Vantral, not yet 3 years out of the officer academy on Ilven, wrote the number down in her tactical log exactly as it was given, 050000. She had written down 41 such numbers in her career so far, 41 worlds. All of them had come in under the estimate, some by hours. She did not know yet that this would be the number she remembered for the rest of her life. 900 hulls was not, by the standards of the 9th Reclamation Fleet, an especially large commitment. Kallavan had taken worlds with 40 ships and worlds with 2,000, and the number itself had never correlated with difficulty so much as with a planet's raw size, and the thoroughness the throne wanted demonstrated for the benefit of whichever neighboring systems might be watching. Earth had drawn 900 not because anyone in the fleet's planning office believed it would need them, but because a species this young, this scattered, this recently arrived at anything resembling unified spaceflight, made an excellent stage for exactly the kind of overwhelming, unhurried spectacle the Empire liked its subjugated worlds to hear about second-hand. Not a battle, but a demonstration, executed with the calm thoroughness of a species that had stopped finding conquest interesting several thousand years earlier, and now performed it mostly out of habit and administrative necessity. That was, Kallavan reflected, watching his staff disperse to their stations after the briefing, the actual danger in a campaign like this one. Not the enemy, who by every metric his intelligence officers had compiled was underarmed, underorganized, and barely a century removed from burning fossil fuels for propulsion, but the fleet's own comfort. 3,000 campaigns bred a particular kind of competence that, left unexamined, curdled quietly into assumption. And assumption was the one adversary the standard reclamation model had never been designed to detect, because the model itself was built from nothing but assumptions that had happened so far to keep being correct. He did not share this reflection with anyone. It was not the kind of thought a fleet admiral said aloud in a briefing hall, and in any case he did not yet believe it applied to this particular morning. merely that it was worth having in reserve, the way a good officer kept a contingency he hoped never to need. He would think of the thought again, with considerably less theoretical detachment, in just under 5 hours. Inside the ridge, 4 hours and 48 minutes stood between Reya Boone and whatever the Empire had decided Earth's face would look like when it was done being conquered. She checked the breaker panel behind her, an old habit, older than the war, and her fingers found the brass toggle switches of a control board that predated her by 2 decades, a relic her superiors called the dead system, and which she alone, for 2 years, had spent every off-shift oiling, testing, and quietly resoldering. "You're going to love your museum piece one of these days, Boone," Sergeant Priya Chen had told her more than once, not unkindly. Priya ran the number 4 rail battery topside. In the gun pit the crews called the molar because of its shape on the old survey maps. She said it again now, over the internal line, half a joke and half a prayer. "Tell your dead system to wake up. Company's coming." "It's not dead," Reya said. "It's just quiet." The Ashford Line had not been built to win a war quickly. It had been built, across 2 generations, by people who assumed they would lose the first fight and needed the ability to still be standing for the second one. Reya's grandfather, Silas Boone, had been a young structural engineer when the original missile silos beneath this ridge were decommissioned after the treaty years, and he had spent the back half of his life converting dead concrete into something that could still hold a line if the satellites went dark, if the networks failed, if every clever piece of modern electronics in the country got jammed, hacked, or vaporized on the same afternoon. He built redundancy into the granite itself. He built a copper backbone that ran on nothing but electrons and human hands. He had died 14 years before an imperial fleet ever entered the system, and he had never once been thanked for it. And Reya thought about him now with the particular ache of a person who understood, for the first time in her life, exactly why a stubborn old man had spent 30 years wiring a mountain. 6 kilometers south of Capacitor House 2, in a fold of granite the surveyors had never bothered to name, and the garrison had named for them the first week anyone stood watch there. Lieutenant Sofia Marsh crouched behind a waist-high barricade of poured concrete and rebar, and did the same math everyone on Ashford Ridge was doing that morning, just with a smaller number of guns to do it with. They called the place the Gullet because from the observation post on the ridge above it, the defile looked exactly like what its name promised. A narrow granite throat 4 meters wide at its tightest point, walled on both sides by sheer rock 40 feet high, running 200 meters between the southern approach's open scrubland and the service road that climbed, eventually, to the underside of the ridge itself. It had been blasted wider than nature made it, decades ago, by engineers who understood that a mountain this size could not be walled everywhere, and that the next best thing to walling everywhere was making sure the enemy only had a handful of places worth trying, and then making every one of those places cost more than any sane commander would want to pay. 28 soldiers held it. Sofia Marsh, 24 years old and 11 months into a command she had never expected to get so young, had spent that morning walking the length of the gullet twice, checking the interlocking fields of fire from the 3 coilgun nests dug into alcoves along its walls, checking the sally ports that let a fire team duck behind cover and reappear 30 meters up the line, checking, for the 4th time since dawn, that the portable barricades stacked at the defile's narrowest throat were racked in the order she'd need them. "You're going to wear a groove in that concrete, LT," said Sergeant Walt Prentice, who had been holding chokepoints for the Ashford Line since before Sofia was old enough to know what one was, and who had quietly made it his business, over her 11 months in command, to make sure she never had to learn the job the hard way twice. He was 61, built like a man who had spent 4 decades being underestimated by people half his age, and he treated Sofia's rank with a respect that had taken her the first 3 months to realize was completely genuine. "I keep thinking there's something I haven't checked," Sofia said. There's always something you haven't checked. That's what makes it a defile and not a parade ground. Prentice nodded at the barricade stack. You checked the sequence 3 times already. It's the same sequence it was the first time. I know. She did know. She checked it a 4th time anyway because some part of her understood without being told that the difference between a chokepoint that held and a chokepoint that didn't was rarely the plan. It was whether the people holding it had rehearsed the plan until their hands did it without their heads getting involved. Corporal Inez Duarte, 22, the platoon's combat medic, was laying out her aid station in the lee of the second barricade, with the brisk, unhurried economy of someone who had already decided, privately, exactly how many of the next several hours she expected to spend using it. You know what I keep thinking about, she said, to nobody in particular, snapping a field dressing pack into its pouch. I keep thinking about how somebody built this place assuming we'd need it, not hoping, assuming. That's the whole ridge, said Private Quame Osai, 20, from the #1 coilgun nest, where he had spent the last hour running diagnostics on a weapon that did not need a 5th diagnostic and clearly knew it. My grandmother used to say the Ashford Line was built by people who'd already decided to lose the first war so their kids could win the second one. Your grandmother sounds like she'd have gotten along with Reya Boone, Prentice said. She'd have married him, Osai said. Twice. It got the laugh it was built to get, small and short, the kind of laugh that existed in a chokepoint at dawn specifically to be spent before the shooting started, because nobody laughed like that once it did. Private Noah Whitfield, 19, the platoon's youngest, stood at the mouth of the defile with a riot shield strapped across his back, an old pattern ballistic shield, heavier than anything the modern loadout manuals recommended, that Prentice had insisted every point man in the platoon carry regardless of what the manual said, and watched the southern scrubland through a spotting scope with the specific stillness of someone trying very hard to look like he wasn't nervous. They're not going to come this way, he said. Everybody says the real fight's west. Why would they waste anything down here? Because it's the quiet way in, Sofia said, coming to stand beside him. Because if I were planning this assault, I wouldn't spend everything trying to punch through the front door while the whole mountain's watching. I'd send something quiet around the side while everyone upstairs is busy and hope nobody built a door there. Did somebody build a door there? No, Sofia said. They built us instead. She looked at him, at the shield too heavy for a 19-year-old's shoulders, at the particular kind of fear that lived in a soldier who had trained for this exact morning and still, somehow, hadn't believed until now that it was actually going to arrive. You're not going to hold this line by yourself, Whitfield. You're not supposed to. Nobody in the gullet holds anything by themselves. That's the entire design. You hold your 4 meters, the next team holds theirs, and none of us needs to be a hero, because the ground does half the work and the person to your left does the other half. It was not a speech. Sofia did not believe in speeches. She had sat through enough of them at the officer academy to develop a permanent distrust of any sentence that sounded like it was building toward applause. It was closer to a fact she was reciting mostly to remind herself it was true. Because 4 hours and change from now, whatever happened in the gullet was going to happen to 28 specific people, whose names she had memorized her first week in command. And she had promised herself, privately, the night she took the platoon, that she would know every one of those names well enough to write the letters herself if it came to that. At 4 hours, 41 minutes, word came down the hardline from the spine, the same line that fed Capacitor House 2, spliced south along a spur nobody outside the garrison knew existed, that the fleet's opening bombardment had begun, and the gullet's 28 soldiers stood in their positions and listened to a sound they could not see, a compression that came up through the rock the same way it came up through Reya Boone's boots 6 kilometers north, and waited for their own turn to matter. Won't be long now, Prentice said, settling into the #2 nest beside Osai with the unhurried calm of a man who had done this before, and intended to keep doing it exactly the same way every time. Because panic was a luxury the gullet's engineering had never been built to accommodate. Eyes on the scrub, Whitfield. They'll come quiet if they come. Quiet's the whole point of trying this door. Sofia Marsh checked the barricade sequence a fifth time, found it unchanged, and made herself stop, because Prentice was right, and because the next several hours were going to ask her for a great many things and endless checking was not going to be the one that mattered. She keyed her own hardline to capacitor house 2, more out of habit than expectation, and was almost surprised when Reya Boone's voice answered. "Gullet actual to ridge control," Sofia said. "We're green, all positions manned holding for contact. How's it look from up there?" "Loud," Reya said. "You'll know if it comes your way." "Good luck, Lieutenant." "Good luck's for people who don't have a plan," Sofia said, and heard faintly something that might have been a laugh on the other end of the line before the connection dropped back to standby silence. She settled in behind the first barricade, checked her weapon one final time out of a habit she'd stopped pretending was rational, and waited for the southern scrubland to tell her whether 4 generations of granite and rebar were about to be worth what they cost to build. At 3 hours and 59 minutes, the sky over Ashford Ridge went white. It was not an explosion so much as a correction. Orbital kinetic rounds, tungsten spears the length of freight cars, arriving at a velocity that turned the atmosphere itself into a hammer. Reya felt it through the floor before she heard it, a compression that traveled up through 600 feet of rock and into the soles of her boots like a struck bell. Dust sifted from the ceiling. The lights flickered, held, and one string of them along the east wall gave up entirely. "That's the softening pass," Colonel Ezra Havorson said over the command net, his voice flat and unhurried in a way that had taken him 30 years in uniform to earn. He commanded the whole of the Ashford Line from a bunker 2 levels down called the Spine, and he said the words the way a man reads a weather report he has already prepared for. "Hold positions. Report status by pit." The reports came in, pit by pit, gun by gun, in the clipped cadence of people who had drilled this exact moment more times than any of them wanted to remember. The molar was intact. Battery 6 had lost an optical mast to debris but was otherwise green. The surface minefield along the eastern approach had detonated exactly 3 charges, decoys, deliberately placed shallow, meant to look like real hits on imperial sensor returns, and cost the Empire nothing but confusion. Aboard the Unbroken, an analyst reported the strike pattern's results to Admiral Kallavan, with the faint, unbothered satisfaction of a man confirming a known outcome. Surface installations suppressed within projected parameters, Fleet Admiral. Structural integrity of the primary defense feature reads as compromised. Kallavan studied the sensor return a moment longer than the report required. Compromised was doing a great deal of work in that sentence for a mountain that had not moved. He filed the thought away, not doubt, not yet, only the small itch of a man who had learned, across 3,000 worlds, to notice when a word was carrying more weight than the data beneath it. "Proceed to Phase 2, he said. "Landers away." 4 hours, 31 minutes. The first wave of drop craft came down through the smoke like hail with intent, 42 vessels breaking atmosphere in a spread pattern, designed to saturate the ridge's approaches faster than point defense could track them all. Reya watched the plot resolve on the secondary display. She was not a gunner, had never claimed to be one. Her job was keeping the batteries fed with power and her hands steady on the board that made that possible. And she watched Priya's voice come back on the line, clipped and businesslike, as the Molar's twin coil guns began walking fire across the drop lanes. "Splash 2, Priya said. "Splash 4. They're bunching on the second approach. They think it's clear ground." It was not clear ground. It had not been clear ground in 11 years. The eastern saddle between 2 shoulders of the ridge looked, on every scan the Empire owned, like the softest route in. Silas Boone had chosen it personally in his last working decade, as the place to bury the deepest minefield on the mountain and camouflage it as an old landslide scar. 6 landers came down into the saddle in the first 90 seconds of the second wave. 4 of them did not come back up. In the amphitheater above the world, the casualty projection updated on Kallavan's tactical display, and for the first time in the briefing, a small dissonant number appeared beside the expected one. Adjutant Vantral watched him look at it. She watched him not react. That more than the number itself was what she wrote down in her log, in the private shorthand she kept for herself and no one else. He saw it. He did not say anything. Casualties within acceptable variance for terrain-adaptive defense, Kallavan said aloud for the hall. Continue the assault. Compress the timeline where opportunity allows. 4 hours, 6 minutes. Inside the ridge, Reya Boone wiped rock dust from the breaker panel with her sleeve, checked the load on capacitor house 2's primary bank, and did not let herself think about how many hours were left, because there were still 4 of them, and 4 hours was a long time to spend afraid. The first hour had cost the Empire 6 landers, 41 soldiers, and one small, private doubt in the mind of a fleet admiral who did not yet have a name for what he was feeling, because in 3,000 campaigns he had never had reason to learn one. Ashford Ridge had cost nothing yet but nerve. That would not last. Everyone dug into that mountain knew it would not last. They had built the place, generation over generation, on the specific and unglamorous understanding that the first hour was always the cheapest one, and that what mattered was what you had left when the cheap hours ran out. At 3 hours, 58 minutes, the southern scrubland outside the gullet did exactly what Sofia Marsh had told Whitfield it would not have any reason to do, and did it quietly enough that the platoon's first warning came not from a sensor but from Whitfield's own voice, pitched low and flat in the particular way voices go when the person speaking is trying not to spook whatever they've just seen. Movement, he said. Tree line 200 meters, low profile. That's not scrub blowing, that's people. Sofia was at his shoulder inside 4 seconds, scoped to her eye, and found what he'd found. A dispersed line of imperial infantry, maybe 40 strong, moving through the scrub in short bounds with the kind of discipline that told her immediately this was not the same doctrine that had walked into the eastern minefield 6 kilometers north. These soldiers moved like they expected to be watched. They used what cover the terrain offered instead of trusting the terrain to be empty, and they carried, slung low and close to their bodies, something that Os identified through the number 1 nest's optics with a flatness that didn't quite hide how much he didn't like being right. Breaching charges, he said. Heavy ones. They're not here to fight through the gullet. They're here to blow the walls down and go around it. It was, Sofia thought, watching the formation spread wider as it approached, a genuinely reasonable plan, and that was the part that frightened her more than the number 40 did. An enemy that tried to walk straight down the throat of the defile was an enemy the gullet had been built, explicitly, methodically, across 2 generations to kill. An enemy that understood the defile was a trap and tried to erase the trap's walls instead, was an enemy that had actually looked at the ground and drawn the correct conclusion from it. And the gullet's engineers, however thorough they had been, could not have anticipated every version of correct. Ridge control, gullet actual, Sofia said into the hard line, voice pitched low even though there was no one nearby to overhear it, old habit overriding new necessity. Contact, southern approach, 40+ infantry with heavy demolition charges. They're not committing to the throat. They're setting up to breach the north wall about 80 meters up from the mouth. Request permission to engage before they get charges placed. Permission granted, came Havorson's voice, thinner than it would be an hour from then but still carrying the particular calm that made every soldier on the mountain believe, at least for the length of the transmission, that someone somewhere had the whole shape of the day in hand. Gullet actual, you are cleared to open the engagement on your own timing. You know that ground better than anyone at the spine does. Fight your fight. Sofia had run this exact scenario in rehearsal 11 times since taking command, and every one of those 11 rehearsals had taught her the same lesson. The moment to shoot was not the moment the enemy came into range. It was the moment the enemy committed to a plan that range alone would not let them abandon. She watched the demolition team split from the main formation, watched them start their approach to the north wall in a tight cluster that made sense only if they believed, with real confidence, that nothing inside the defile could see them yet. "Osai Prentice, the demolition cluster on my mark," she said. "Whitfield's second squad, hold the throat in case this is a feint and the real push comes straight down the middle. Duart, stand by." The number 1 and number 2 nests opened within a half-second of each other, and the demolition cluster, 6 soldiers who had believed, until that exact moment, that they were still 40 seconds from being seen, came apart under coordinated coilgun fire before a single charge reached the wall. It was not, Sofia made herself remember even as she watched it happen, a clean thing to be relieved about. 6 people had been alive 90 seconds earlier, moving through scrub with a plan that had made sense to whoever gave it to them, and now they weren't, and somewhere 600 kilometers overhead a number had just ticked upward on a screen that would never show anyone's face. She let herself feel exactly as much of that as she could afford, which by her own private accounting was about 2 seconds, and then she was calling the next correction, because the remaining 34 soldiers had stopped bounding forward and started doing the thing that trained infantry did when a plan died in front of them. They adapted, fast, and split into 3 smaller elements trying 3 different approaches to the wall at once. "They're going to try to overwhelm the nests with numbers on more than one axis," Prentice said, tracking one element through his sights with the flat patience of a man who had watched this exact tactic fail before on other worlds, against other walls. "It's a good idea if you don't know the ground. It's a bad idea if you do." It was a bad idea. The Gullet's 3 coilgun nests had been sighted, decades earlier, with overlapping fields of fire specifically, so that no single approach axis could be attacked without exposing the attacker to at least 2 guns at once. And the Imperial infantry, competent, disciplined, badly informed, discovered that fact in the same 90 seconds it took the platoon's sallyport teams to reposition and close the last gaps in the kill zone. Sofia counted 11 Imperial soldiers reach usable cover inside the defile's mouth. She counted 4 of those 11 make it another 30 meters before Whitfield's second squad, dug into a sally port exactly where the original engineers had put it for exactly this purpose, ended the advance with a controlled burst that cost the platoon nothing but ammunition. It should have ended there. It nearly did. But the Imperial commander on the ground, whoever he was, wherever he was watching from, had one more answer, and it arrived as a concentrated volley of grenade-launched smoke that filled the Gullet's throat in under 10 seconds, blinding every optic in the defile at once, and turning Sofia's carefully overlapping fields of fire into a wall of gray nothing. "Osai, report," she said, and heard nothing but static and the distant, muffled crack of small arms fire somewhere inside the smoke. "Contact! Contact in the smoke, they're pushing through blind." That was Whitfield's voice, cracking on the second word, and Sofia was moving before she'd finished processing the fear in it, dropping from the command position toward the throat with her own weapon up, because a defile built to kill an enemy who could be seen was not, by definition, built to be held once nobody could see anything at all. It was Duart, of all people, who solved it, Duart, who had spent the lull before contact laying out an aid station instead of a weapon, and who remembered, in the specific way medics remembered things that combat soldiers sometimes didn't have room to, that the Gullet's original engineers had installed thermal beacons at every sally port specifically for exactly this contingency, a low-tech answer to a problem nobody had needed high-tech sensors to solve. "Thermal switch, north wall, second sally port," she shouted over the platoon net, already moving toward it herself with the same economical speed she'd shown laying out bandages 20 minutes earlier. It'll burn the smoke off in under a minute. It's not subtle, but neither is dying blind. Sofia keyed it without asking who'd approved it, because there was no time left to ask anyone anything, and the thermal charge went up in a column of white heat that ate through the smoke bank from the inside out, and in the 11 seconds, it took the gullet's throat to become visible again. Every soldier still standing in it who was not wearing the platoon's own colors went down under fire from 3 directions. Because Prentice and Osai had never actually stopped shooting into the smoke at the muzzle flashes they could still track, and Whitfield's squad had held their 4 meters exactly, the way Sofia had told him to, without needing to be a hero. Because the person on either side of him had held theirs too. The southern approach went quiet at 3 hours, 44 minutes. Sofia Marsh stood in the settling haze of a defile that had cost the Empire its entire demolition element and the better part of an infantry platoon, and did not feel anything that resembled triumph, because Duarte was already moving down the line checking her own people for wounds, and finding, too, a graze along Osai's forearm that he hadn't mentioned until she physically grabbed his wrist to check it, and a fragment wound in a private named Rey's shoulder that would need more than a field dressing, but would not, Duarte confirmed within the first 30 seconds of looking at it, cost him the arm. Ridge control, gullet actual, Sofia said into the hardline, her voice steadier than her hands currently were. Southern approach is clear. We took 2 wounded, neither critical. Enemy element is combat ineffective. Requesting resupply on smoke countermeasures and coilgun charge packs, because if they come back this way they're going to come back smarter, and I'd like to still have something to shoot with when they do. Copy, gullet actual, Reya's voice came back, and there was something in it, not quite warmth. The day hadn't left room yet for warmth, but something adjacent to it, that Sofia chose to hear as the sound of one exhausted stranger telling another exhausted stranger that she'd been listening the whole time. Resupplies moving. Good work down there, Lieutenant. Tell that to the ground, Sofia said. The ground did most of it. She looked down the length of the gullet, at Prentice already resetting the No. 2 nest's ammunition belt with the unhurried competence of a man who had never for a moment doubted the outcome, at Whitfield sitting against the barricade with his shield still strapped across his back, and his hands shaking in exactly the way 19-year-old hands were allowed to shake once the shooting actually stopped, and understood that the ground alone had never been the whole answer. The ground had bought them the fight. What they'd done with the fight, they'd done themselves. By 3 hours and 50 minutes, the second wave had learned the shape of the minefield and stopped feeding it. Imperial landers began threading the gaps between the buried charges with a precision that told Reya, more clearly than any report from the spine, that the Empire had already updated its maps. That was the part people forgot about a competent enemy. It only had to be surprised once. "They're not stupid," Colonel Halvorsen said over the command net, as if he'd heard her think it. "They're fast learners with 900 ships and no patience for a second mistake. Pit leaders assume they know every trick we've shown them. Nobody shows them a new one until it counts." Infantry came down behind the landers in dispersal pods that cracked open 100 meters up and released their troops on cushioned drop lines, a tactic built for worlds with thinner defenses and softer resolve. The Ashford Line's point defense turrets, dug into blast-hardened cupolas along the ridge's spine, opened up before the pods finished opening. It was not glamorous work. It was geometry and discipline, gunners tracking falling shapes against a smoke-streaked sky and letting the machine math do what machine math was for. 40 Imperial soldiers reached the ground in the first infantry wave. 26 of them reached cover. Reya heard it on the internal line before she saw the numbers confirmed, a note of surprise in the voice of one of the Moeller's loaders, quickly swallowed, because surprise was not a thing you let live long in a fire control net. "They're digging in on the tailless slope. That's not supposed to be viable ground. That slope's all loose shale. Nobody trains to hold that." "They're not holding it," Priya said. They're using it for cover to get their heavy weapons teams close enough to range the Molar's mast. Boone, I need eyes on the west approach. I think that's where the real push is coming. Reya split her display, routed a spare optical feed from a camouflaged post 200 meters west, and watched a second column of Imperial infantry, bigger, better spaced, moving with none of the first wave's haste, advancing under the cover of a rolling smoke barrage laid down by orbital fire. This was not the improvisation of soldiers meeting unexpected resistance. This was Kallavan's fleet recalculating in real time and sending its answer downhill. 3 hours, 31 minutes. Aboard the Unbroken, Admiral Kallavan reviewed the Western approach's projected timeline and made a decision that, on any of his 3,000 prior worlds, would have been unremarkable. He committed a second armor detachment 2 hours ahead of the model's schedule, accepting a higher initial cost in exchange for compressing the assault back toward totality. "You're spending reserves early," Adjutant Vantral said before she could stop herself. It was not her place to question the pacing of a fleet admiral's campaign, and she felt the silence that followed the words settle over her like a physical weight. Kallavan did not look offended. He looked, if anything, mildly interested, the way a man might look at a data point he had not expected to generate. "The model assumes resistance collapses once the defense's coordination center is neutralized," he said. "We have not yet neutralized their coordination center. Until we do, every hour we spend probing is an hour I would rather spend paying for directly. Track the Western approach. Note the moment their center goes dark. Everything downstream of that moment should move very quickly." Vantral wrote it down. Everything downstream of that moment should move very quickly. She underlined it twice, because some instinct she did not yet have a name for told her that this line, too, she would want to remember later. Ahead of the armor, the Empire sent something smaller and quieter first. A spread of thumb-sized reconnaissance drones, 40 of them, dropped from high orbit to drift down on the wind and map every battery position on Ashford Ridge with a precision no visual scan could match. It was, Reya had to admit, listening to the report come in, a genuinely elegant solution to the problem her mountain presented. You could not jam a network that didn't exist. But you could still see it, if you looked closely enough. And closely enough was exactly what 40 drones scattered across 6 square kilometers were built to do. "Passive optics only, no transmission signature yet," said specialist Mateo Reyes, 19 years old and 8 months into a job Reya had spent the last 6 of those months training him for, hunched over the auxiliary sensor board beside her in Capacitor House 2. "They're just watching. Waiting to phone it all home at once so we can't take out the relay before the data's already sent." "Then we don't wait for them to phone it in," Reya said, and reached for a switch that had nothing to do with the copper spine at all. A separate, older system entirely, one her grandfather had built for a different problem, and that she had spent a rainy autumn 2 years ago repurposing for this one. Scattered across the ridge's approaches, disguised as boulders and dead stumps, and one deliberately ugly weather station nobody had ever questioned, sat 41 decoy emitters that did nothing but generate the electromagnetic and thermal signature of a functioning coilgun battery, badly, on a loop, at random intervals. To a drone doing a fast passive sweep, they looked exactly like what the Empire was hoping to find. 31 of the 40 Imperial drones logged a decoy as a live target before their pass ended. Reyes watched the recon swarm relay its collected data back to the fleet with a kind of horrified fascination. "They're about to shoot 41 empty rocks and 9 real guns," he said. "They're about to shoot 41 empty rocks and 9 real guns they don't know are real," Reya corrected. "That's the whole trick. Grandpa always said the second best lie is telling somebody exactly where you are. The best lie is telling them 30 places at once." Aboard the Unbroken, the targeting solution that came back from the drone sweep looked, by every metric Imperial fire control trusted, like a complete and confident map of the Ashford Line's true battery network. and it was almost entirely wrong, salted just enough with real positions among the decoys that no analyst reviewing it in the time available could have told the difference. Kallavan authorized a precision strike against the 11 highest confidence targets the sweep identified. 2 of them were real. The Empire spent 9 guided munitions destroying 9 pieces of scrap metal and rebar built specifically to be destroyed, and Ashford Ridge lost 1 genuine position, an already damaged optical mast on Battery 6, in exchange. It was not a victory. Reya did not let herself call it one, not with 2 names already waiting to be read at the end of the day that she did not yet know about. But it was 3 hours of targeting data the Empire had spent good munitions confirming was mostly fiction, and on a mountain that measured its survival in minutes bought rather than battles won outright. 3 hours of confusion was worth more than any single gun. The Western approach did not move quickly for the Empire. It moved at the grinding pace of a hillside that had been surveyed, sighted, and pre-ranged by 3 generations of engineers who had never expected to fight this particular war, but had built for it anyway. Heavy weapons teams that thought they had found defilade discovered that the defilade had been mapped decades earlier and filled with pressure-triggered charges disguised as drainage culverts. An armored column that tried to flank along the ridge's northern shoulder found the ground there deliberately soft, engineered to swallow tracked vehicles up to their hulls, a trap so old that the crews manning the guns above it had grown up calling it Grandpa's Ditch without ever being told, as children, exactly whose grandfather it referred to. By 3 hours, 4 minutes, the Empire had lost 11 landers, 1 armored column's lead element, and this was the number that Kallavan did not share with the amphitheater, though Vantral saw it cross his private display, 193 soldiers. It was, by any standard the Empire had ever applied to a standard reclamation, a punishing first 2 hours. It was also, Kallavan reminded himself, still within the outer edge of acceptable variance. 3,000 campaigns had taught him that outer edges existed for a reason. He had simply never before had cause to use one. Inside the ridge, the cost was arriving too, in smaller, harder currency. A kinetic round found the access tunnel connecting Battery 6 to the surface and collapsed 40 meters of it, trapping 2 soldiers under rubble long enough that by the time a rescue crew dug them clear, one of them, a 20-year-old private named Dara Nkemelu who had been on the mountain for exactly 9 days, was already gone. Reya heard the report over the net in the same flat cadence as every other report casualty. 1. Battery 6 access tunnel, and made herself keep working, because that was the job, and because the alternative was letting the number stop her hands, and stopped hands killed more people than grief ever saved. 2 hours 50, Owen said quietly from the comms table. He wasn't asking a question. He was marking time the way sailors mark a coastline, so that later, if there was a later, someone would be able to say exactly when things happened. At 2 hours, 41 minutes, the Empire changed its approach entirely, and that was when Reya understood, with the particular clarity of someone whose entire professional life had been spent thinking about how systems failed, exactly what Kallavan's next move would be. It began as a hum in the deep structure of the mountain's own network, a frequency that did not belong to any Ashford Line equipment, climbing steadily through bands that the ridge's engineers had spent a decade hardening against exactly this kind of attack. Every screen in capacitor house 2 flickered in the same half-second. Somewhere down the corridor, an alarm meant for exactly this contingency began its low, insistent pulse. Electronic warfare barrage, Owen said, already reaching for the hardline handset that hung, absurdly old-fashioned, on a hook beside his console. Full spectrum. They're not probing anymore, they're trying to blind the whole grid at once. Colonel Havorson's voice came through thinner now, fighting static that had not existed 30 seconds earlier. All stations, this is the spine. We are under coordinated jamming across every network channel. Primary fire control mesh is degrading. Pit leaders, prepare to lose central targeting data. Repeat, prepare to lose central coordination. Reya's hand was already moving before the colonel finished the sentence, because she had run this exact drill in her head more times than she could count, alone, on shifts nobody else wanted, oiling brass switches that her own supervisor had once suggested she stop wasting her time on. She pulled the cover off the panel her grandfather had built, and beneath the modern glass and network telemetry of Capacitor House 2, the copper spine of the Ashford Line lay waiting. Hardwired lines, mechanical relays, breaker switches with hand-stamped labels in Reya Boone's own engineering script. None of it touching a network that any imperial signal could reach, because none of it had ever been built to. "Everyone still online, say so now," she said into the internal line, her voice steadier than she felt. "Because I've got a system that doesn't care if they jam every satellite in the sky, but it only works if somebody's hands are on the switches, and right now that's me and whoever else still has a hard line." 600 kilometers up, Fleet Admiral Kallavan watched the ridge's networked fire control signature collapse across 4 separate bands simultaneously, precisely as his electronic warfare officers had projected, and allowed himself, for the first time since totality had been declared, something close to satisfaction. "Coordination center neutralized," the report read. In 3,000 prior campaigns, that sentence had always meant the same thing happened next. Resistance fragmented into isolated, uncoordinated pockets that a determined ground assault mopped up within the hour, because no defense the Empire had ever faced could fight effectively once its central nervous system went dark. "Compress the assault," Kallavan ordered. "Full ground commitment on the western and eastern approaches. Their coordination is gone. Take the primary structure." Adjutant Vantral watched the order go out and felt, for reasons she could not yet articulate, the beginning of something that was not quite dread and not quite awe, the sense of standing very close to a machine that was about to discover, for the first time, that it had been built on an assumption nobody had ever bothered to test. 2 hours, 31 minutes. The Empire came at the Ashford Line with everything it had reserved for the moment its enemy's mind went dark, and the Ashford Line, whose mind had never lived in one place to begin with, kept firing. The copper spine was not fast. That was the first thing Reya had to teach herself all over again, crouched at the panel with a headset clamped over one ear and a hand-cranked field telephone in the other, because the old system did not paint a picture of the battlefield the way the networked one had. It gave her voices instead. Priya at the molar, a spotter named Corporal Faisal Idris dug into an observation slit on the ridge's north knuckle, a gunnery sergeant at Battery 6 who had lost his optics an hour ago, and was now calling fire the way artillerymen had called it for 200 years, by grid square and correction. "Drop 50, left 20, that's the column forming up on the talus," Idris said, and Reya repeated the correction into the hardline to Battery 6, and 11 seconds later the talus slope disappeared under a coilgun salvo that the Empire's jamming had never touched, because there had been nothing in that chain for the jamming to find. No transmitter, no network node, just copper and voices, and people who had drilled this exact failure mode until it stopped feeling like a failure at all. "Boone, you beautiful relic," Priya said, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there in over an hour, not relief, not yet, but the specific steadiness of a soldier who has just been handed a reason to keep going. It was slower. It missed things the networked system would have caught. It could not coordinate 4 batteries in the same half-second the way the mesh had. But it worked, and it kept working, and every minute it kept working was a minute the Empire's own model insisted should not exist. At 2 hours, 9 minutes, an alarm Reya had never personally heard outside of drills began sounding from the tunnel junction below the spine, a deep, mechanical klaxon reserved for exactly one contingency, and the worst one. "Breach," Owen said, his voice gone tight and quick. There in the lower access tunnel. Ground forces, not landers. They came up through the old drainage cut. That's not on any current survey. How did they? They didn't find it, Reya said, already moving toward the arms locker bolted beside Capacitor House 2's blast door, because during a fight there was no time left over for being only an engineer. They cut it. Somebody down there has demolition charges and a very good reason to use them. Colonel Havorson's answer came through the command net a half-second later, and it was the first time all day his voice had lost its weather report calm. Confirmed. Imperial Special Operations element in the lower tunnel, 6 to 10 hostiles, moving toward the spine's primary junction. All available personnel converge and hold. I say again, hold the junction. The fight that followed did not belong to coilguns or capacitor banks. It belonged to corridors 4 feet wide, to the flat crack of small arms fire in a stone throat that amplified every sound into something enormous, to a company clerk named Tomas Ferreira, 19 years old, 6 months out of training, assigned to the spine because someone had needed a runner and he had good legs, throwing himself into a doorway to drag a wounded engineer clear of a grenade's blast radius, and taking most of that blast into his own back instead. He did not die instantly. He died 11 minutes later in a triage corridor 2 levels up, with Owen Ape holding his hand and telling him, over and over, in a voice that had stopped being steady, that he'd done exactly right, that the mountain was still standing because of what he'd done. Reya did not go to the junction. Her place was the breaker panel, and she stayed at it, and hated staying at it, because the copper spine needed hands on it every second of the fight, and there was no one else who knew its logic well enough to keep 4 batteries synchronized through voice alone. She listened to the fight over the command net instead, controlled bursts, a shouted correction, the flat detonation of a breaching charge that failed to breach anything but concrete. And she kept calling corrections to Battery 6 and the molar with a voice that did not shake, because Priya and Idris and the gunners on the surface needed her voice not to shake more than she needed to let it. The junction held. 6 Imperial Special Operations soldiers had entered the lower tunnel. None of them left it. Colonel Havorson took a fragment wound to the shoulder in the final exchange, stayed on his feet through sheer refusal, and delegated field command of the tunnel network to a staff sergeant, while he kept the overall defense's threads in his one good hand, because a mountain does not stop needing a commander just because the commander is bleeding. The breaching charge that had failed to breach the junction had not failed entirely. It had cracked a feed line running from the auxiliary ready magazine outside Battery 6, and the spark that followed found a residue of propellant dust that 2 decades of maintenance schedules had never quite managed to eliminate. Ray smelled it before the alarm caught up to him, a bitter, metallic sharpness under the ordinary dust of the tunnels, and was on his feet and moving before Reya finished reading the sensor spike on her board. "Fire, Battery 6 ready magazine," he said into the hardline, already hauling the suppression cart out of its wall alcove. "If that cooks off, it takes the whole feed line, maybe the battery with it." "Go," Reya said, and meant it as permission and prayer in the same breath, because sending a 19-year-old toward a magazine fire was not a decision any part of her wanted to make twice. She stayed at the panel, someone had to. The gun still needed a voice, and listened to Reyes breathing over the open channel as he and 2 others fought a fire in a 4-foot corridor, with extinguishers never designed for a battle, already 3 hours old and everyone in it running on fumes. They contained it in 6 minutes that felt considerably longer to everyone listening. Reyes came back with singed eyebrows, a scorched sleeve, and the particular quiet of someone who has just understood, all at once, that the training scenarios he'd found tedious 8 months ago had been describing this exact night. "Magazine secure," he reported, voice not quite steady. "Feed lines rerouted around the damage. Battery 6 is still in this." "Good," Reya said, and did not say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying, and because if she let herself say what she actually felt in that moment, pride, terror, something too large for either word alone, she was not certain she would get it back under control before the next crisis arrived. On Ashford Ridge, gratitude and grief were both luxuries you filed for later. There would, everyone hoped, eventually be a later in which to spend them. 1 hour, 58 minutes. Aboard the Unbroken, the Special Operations Elements beacon went dark on Kallavan's tactical display, and this time the silence in the amphitheater was not the silence of an admiral withholding a reaction. Several officers actually turned to look at him. The insertion team was meant to reach the coordination center and confirm its neutralization directly, Kallavan said, to no one and everyone. They did not reach it. They did not report contact with functioning defenses beyond the point of insertion. They simply stopped transmitting. He looked, for the length of one held breath, at the sensor return that insisted the Ashford Line central network was dark, had been dark for nearly 2 hours, and yet the ridge continued to produce coordinated, corrected, disciplined fire against every approach the Empire tried. 3,000 campaigns had given him a great deal of data about what defenders did once their coordination collapsed. None of that data had prepared him for defenders who simply built a second coordination, out of wire and human voices, and kept it in reserve for exactly this hour. "Fleet Admiral," Vantrell said carefully, "should we revise the totality projection?" "Not yet," Kallavan said, and for the first time all day the sentence did not sound entirely certain, even to the man saying it. "Commit the second armored wave. Full weight both approaches. Whatever is keeping their guns synchronized, it is not a network we can jam a second time differently than the first. It is people. People have limits that networks do not." He paused. "Find them. End them." 1 hour, 41 minutes. The Ashford Line had held for 3 hours and 19 minutes against a fleet that had planned, with perfect confidence and no malice in the planning at all, to own the mountain within one. It had cost 17 landers, 2 armored columns lead elements, a special operations team, and though Kallavan had not yet said the number aloud to his own staff, 408 soldiers. It had cost Ashford Ridge 11 wounded, 1 collapsed access tunnel, and 2 names that would be read aloud, months from now, at a memorial none of the people fighting that afternoon had time to imagine yet. Dara Nkemelu. Tomas Ferreira. Reya heard both names over the net within the same 10 minutes, and she let herself feel exactly 1 full breath of grief for each of them, because that was what the drilled discipline of the Ashford Line asked of its people. Not that they feel nothing, but that they feel it on their own schedule, in the seconds they could afford, and then go back to the switches, because the mountain did not stop needing them just because it hurt to keep giving it what it needed. At 1 hour, 41 minutes, the same 10 minutes in which Reya Boone was learning 2 names she would carry for the rest of her life, the southern approach stopped being quiet. It began with artillery, not infantry, a rolling barrage of orbital-guided munitions that walked across the scrubland outside the gullet in a pattern clearly meant to soften the defile's mouth before anything imperial had to walk into it directly. The same lesson, Sofia understood watching the impacts, that Kallavan's fleet had already learned twice over on the western approach and was now applying everywhere at once. Ashford Ridge had taught the Empire, in 3 hours, to stop trusting infantry alone against prepared ground. It had not yet taught the Empire that no amount of preparation on its side could substitute for the preparation already dug into this mountain. "Incoming," Whitfield called, and the platoon went aground behind the gullet's blast-hardened barricades in the same drilled half-second they'd practiced 100 times, and the barrage that followed shook rock dust loose from 40 feet of granite overhead and did, in the end, almost nothing to the positions it was aimed at, because the same engineers who had sighted the coilgun nests had also understood, decades earlier, that anyone eventually shelling this ground would be shelling it from orbit, at a steep angle, into a defile whose walls were higher than the angle of attack could easily clear. They wasted a lot of ordnance being loud, Prentice observed, checking his nest's optics for damage and finding none. Means they're about to be louder in a way that actually matters. Everybody stay sharp. He was right within 4 minutes. A full company came down the southern scrubland this time, not 40 soldiers moving quiet, but nearly 90, in 3 staggered waves with 2 of the same mobile shield platforms that had walked up the western approach an hour earlier. The Empire's answer, plainly, to a defile that had already proven it could not be rushed by numbers alone or breached by stealth. This was neither. This was a company willing to spend itself against the gullet's geometry, until the geometry ran out of ammunition to defend itself with. Because Sofia understood, watching the shield platforms grind forward at the head of the formation, that the Imperial commander on this front had finally done the math every commander on Ashford Ridge had been dreading all morning. The mountain's guns were not infinite. Somewhere, everywhere, on every approach, the Empire had started trying to find that number by testing it directly. Fire discipline stays tight, Sofia said over the platoon net, because 90 soldiers and 2 shield platforms against 28 defenders with finite charge packs was not a fight the gullet could win by matching volume for volume. We are not the molar. We do not have a capacitor bank feeding us. What we have in the racks right now is what we have for the rest of the day. Make every shot count or don't take it. The shield platforms absorbed the nest's opening volleys the way they'd been built to, and Sofia watched her ammunition counter. A simple mechanical dial Prentice had insisted every nest keep, because digital counters were one more thing that could fail at the worst possible moment. Tick down faster than she liked in the first 90 seconds of sustained contact. Osai's nest took the worst of it, positioned closest to the shield platform's advance, and by the 2-minute mark, he was calling status in the clipped, controlled voice of someone doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. I'm at 30% on the belt, LT. These shields are eating everything I've got, and the platforms are still walking. Hold your position, conserve rate of fire, Sofia said, and turned to the problem she'd actually built the gullet's second line to solve, because the Defile's engineers had never expected the nests to win a war of attrition against fresh shield technology alone. Duarte, prep the second barricade line. Whitfield, second squad, on my signal were falling back to the throat's narrow point, and letting the platforms come to us instead of us wearing ourselves out shooting through them from range. It was not retreat. Sofia had drilled the difference into every soldier in the platoon, specifically because she had watched, in training simulations, how easily the two got confused in the noise of an actual fight. A retreat gave up ground because you had nothing left to hold it with. A fallback gave up ground on purpose, to somewhere the ground itself did more of the work. The gullet's narrowest point, the 4-meter throat where the original barricade stack waited, exactly as Sofia had checked it that morning, exactly as she'd checked it 3 times since, was a place where a shield platform's width became a liability instead of an advantage, where the platform's own bulk would jam against the walls before it could clear the corridor, where the soldiers sheltering behind it would be forced into single file and directly into the crossing fire of 2 nests instead of 1. The fallback took 40 seconds, executed under fire, and cost the platoon its first close call of the engagement. Private Reya Boone, already wounded from the smoke fight and fighting one-handed on Duarte's orders, took a fragment across the thigh, crossing the open ground between positions, and went down 8 meters short of cover. It was Prentice who broke from his own nest to drag him the rest of the way, 61 years old and moving like a man half that age, because some decisions did not require a rank to make them, only a person close enough and willing enough to make them. I'm hit, I can still shoot, Reya Boone said, which Duarte ignored entirely in favor of getting a pressure dressing on the wound before he bled out arguing about it. You can still shoot after I stop you from dying, Duarte said. That's the order of operations, Private. Lie still. The shield platforms reached the throat 40 seconds later, exactly where the geometry had promised they would, and exactly as the geometry had promised, they did not fit. The lead platform's generator array scraped granite on both sides, slowing it to a crawl, and the soldiers who had been sheltering behind its width found themselves funneled into a line barely wide enough for two at a time, walking directly into the overlapping fire of both remaining nests at a range where the shield's forward arc could not cover what was happening to their flanks. "Now," Sofia said, and the throat's crossfire opened up, and the Imperial Company's advance, which had cost the gullet 90 seconds of genuine dread and one soldier bleeding on a stretcher, came apart against 4 meters of granite the same way the demolition team had come apart against the north wall 3 hours earlier, because the ground had never stopped being the trap it was built to be. It had only been waiting for the enemy to walk into the part of it that mattered. The company broke at 1 hour, 26 minutes, what remained of it pulling back into the scrubland under covering fire from the surviving shield platform, and Sofia Marsh sat down hard against the second barricade, not because she'd been hit, but because her legs had simply, finally, stopped being willing to hold her up standing, and did the tally she'd been dreading since the barrage started. 4 wounded, including Reya Boone, none of them fatal, all of them stable under Duarte's hands. Ammunition at the number 1 nest down to 18%. The platoons watered down to whatever everyone had left in their own kit, because nobody had thought, 11 months ago, to build a resupply line specifically for a fight that lasted this many hours. "Ridge control, gullet actual," she said into the hardline, and heard her own voice come out rougher than she meant it to. "Second attack repelled. We are combat effective but thin, 18% charge on the forward nest, 4 wounded and stable. If they come a third time with anything bigger, I am not going to be able to promise you the same math." "Copy, gullet actual," Reya said, and this time the pause before she spoke again told Sofia something the words themselves didn't need to. "Resupplies still 90 minutes out on the manifest. We're stretched everywhere right now. You're not the only position calling that in. Hold what you can. If it comes down to falling back to the ridge proper, that's an authorized call, yours to make. Nobody up here is going to second-guess a platoon commander who's been in the fight the last 4 hours." "Understood," Sofia said, and did not say the rest of it, that falling back meant giving the Empire the exact quiet southern route the whole platoon had spent the morning proving didn't exist, and that she had already decided, sometime in the last 90 seconds without quite noticing herself decide it. That the gullet would be held by 28 exhausted soldiers, with 18% charge remaining before it would be handed over by 28 soldiers, who still technically had orders permitting them to leave. She looked down the line at Prentice, resetting his own nest's ammunition with hands that had gone steady again the moment the shooting stopped, at Whitfield helping Duarte splint Reya Boone's leg with the specific gentleness of someone who had spent the morning being terrified and found, apparently, that it hadn't cost him his capacity for gentleness at all, and understood, with the same clarity Reya Boone was reaching 6 kilometers north at almost exactly the same minute. That the mountain was not going to be held by any single thing it had built. It was going to be held by the people who had decided, individually and then together, that holding it was simply the thing they were going to do next. The second armored wave came up the western approach at 1 hour, 38 minutes, in numbers the ridge had not yet seen that day, and Reya Boone put both hands back on the panel her grandfather had built and did the only thing left that made any sense to her. She kept the lights on, and she kept the guns talking, and she did not let herself calculate, the way Kallavan was calculating 600 kilometers overhead, how much longer any of it could possibly last. The armor came in staggered columns, walkers with legs like cathedral scaffolding, interspersed with low, wide-track platforms that Idris identified, with the flat professional calm of a man who had studied every silhouette the Empire owned, as mobile shield generators, designed to advance ahead of infantry and absorb kinetic fire that would otherwise have killed the soldiers behind them. "They learned that from us too," Priya said grimly, tracking one of the shield platforms through the molar's manual optics. Combined arms. Cover the advance, protect the vulnerable element. They're not sending soldiers to die stupid anymore. They're sending soldiers to die smart, and there's a lot more of them who can afford to. The molar's coilguns had a rate of fire that no shield generator, however dense, could indefinitely absorb, and Reya rerouted a third of Capacitor House 2's remaining charge into the battery's feed lines to buy Priya's crew 3 extra salvos before the bank needed to rest. It was not a decision she was supposed to make alone. Under the old network doctrine, power allocation across the grid had been the spine's call, made by algorithms faster than any human hand. But the old doctrine's algorithms were sitting dark under a jamming field that showed no sign of lifting, and someone with her hands on the switches had to decide, in the half-second she actually had, whether the molar's guns mattered more right now than the reserve she was supposed to be hoarding for later. She decided they did. The shield platform's generator failed under the third extra salvo, a soundless collapse of light that took the platform and the 6 soldiers sheltering behind it with it, and the column behind it broke formation, scattering into cover that the ridge's pre-sighted kill zones had been waiting for since before any of the soldiers running into them had been born. 1 hour, 19 minutes. Capacitor House 2's primary bank read down to 41% charge, a number that Reya watched with the specific, private dread of an engineer who understood, better than anyone else on the mountain, exactly what happened to a coilgun battery when its power ran out mid-fight. She began routing what remained toward Battery 6 and the molar exclusively, dimming everything else on the grid that did not directly keep a gun firing, internal lighting, secondary sensors, the climate systems in sections of tunnel that had already been evacuated. The spine went half-dark, running on the barest current the copper spine could spare, and nobody complained because everybody on that mountain understood, without being told twice, what the dimming meant and what it was buying. Aboard the Unbroken, Fleet Admiral Kallavan revised the totality projection for the second time in his career, and the first time in this one. He did it quietly, in a private annotation to his own log rather than an announcement to the hall, because a fleet admiral did not narrate his uncertainty to 200 subordinates unless the uncertainty had already become fact. Revised estimate, totality achieved by hour 5, upper bound. He looked at the words for a long moment before letting the log accept them, and understood, with the particular clarity of a competent man watching his own competence fail to explain something, that upper bound was a phrase he had used perhaps 4 times in 3,000 campaigns, and never once against a target this small. Fleet Admiral, Vantrill's voice when she spoke again had lost the careful neutrality she'd been holding all afternoon. The insertion team's beacon. We recovered partial telemetry from it before it went dark. I think you should see the last 3 seconds. Kallavan reviewed it. 6 armored soldiers, elite by any standard the Empire measured elite against, advancing through a tunnel toward what their sensors told them was an inert, unguarded coordination node, and then gunfire from 3 directions simultaneously, converging with a precision that no ad hoc, panicked defense could have produced. The soldiers had not stumbled into confused resistance. They had walked into a kill box that had been designed, rehearsed, and waiting for them. They didn't lose their coordination when we jammed the network, Kallavan said slowly. They replaced it, in minutes, with something that doesn't require a network at all. Is that possible? Asked a staff officer near the front of the hall, and it was not really a question so much as a plea for the world to make the sense it had always made before. It is apparently what happened, Kallavan said. He did not raise his voice. 3,000 campaigns had taught him that raising his voice never once made a battlefield more tractable. The standard reclamation model assumes a defense's coordination lives in one place, because on every world we have ever reclaimed it has. This defense's coordination does not live in one place. It lives in the people, every one of them. That is not a system I can jam. He was quiet for a moment that stretched half a second too long for the room's comfort. "Commit the reserve strike wing, all of it. I am done spending this campaign an hour at a time." The order rippled outward through the fleet with the particular speed of a decision made by a man who has never before had to make it under pressure. And Adjutant Vantrell, watching him give it, understood that she was witnessing something she had no framework for. Not a fleet admiral losing control of a battle, but a fleet admiral discovering, for the first time in his career, that a battle could refuse to be won on schedule and still, technically, not yet be lost. 1 hour 4 minutes. The reserve strike wing broke atmosphere over Ashford Ridge. In a formation the ridge's spotters had never seen the Empire use. Every remaining lander, every gunship, every walker still in the Unbroken's holds, committed at once, in a single overwhelming mass meant to end the argument by weight rather than finesse. Inside the mountain, Colonel Halvorson, his shoulder bound and his voice thinner than it had been 3 hours earlier, gave the order that every crew on Ashford Ridge had trained a decade to hear and had hoped, on some private, unspoken level, never to actually need. "All batteries, all pits, this is the spine. Fire discipline is suspended. Every gun that can still shoot, shoots. We are not managing our ammunition for tomorrow. There is no tomorrow that matters more than the next 58 minutes. Make them pay for every meter." Reya Boone looked at Capacitor House 2's charge gauge, at 33% and falling, and understood that the mountain her grandfather had built was about to ask her for everything it had left, and that she was going to give it, because that had always been the entire point of the copper spine, of the hand-stamped switches, of 30 years spent by a stubborn dead man preparing for exactly this hour so that his granddaughter would not have to face it with nothing in her hands. 58 minutes, she said out loud to no one and reached for the switches. The reserve strike wing hit the ridge like weather. Gunships raked the surface batteries with suppressive fire meant to keep human heads down while walkers closed the last 400 meters, and for the first time since totality had been declared, the Ashford Line's return fire thinned not from lack of will, but from the simple arithmetic of ammunition, because even a mountain built by a stubborn old man had a bottom to its stores. Battery 6 reported down to 11% reserve rounds. The molar reported 9. "I need 30 more minutes out of both of you," Colonel Halvorson said over the net, his voice fraying at the edges now, blood loss and adrenaline wearing through 30 years of composure like water through stone. 30 minutes and totality passes, and I do not know what happens to their doctrine after that, but I know what happens to ours if we don't hold it. Reya had already anticipated the ammunition problem, because anticipating problems before anyone asked her to was the only skill she'd ever fully trusted in herself, and 4 months earlier, over the objections of a supply officer who called it a waste of storage space, she had convinced Halvorson to let her convert an abandoned silo 2 levels below Capacitor House 2 into an auxiliary magazine, fed by its own short spur of the copper spine. Stocked with rounds nobody upstairs had thought the Ashford Line would ever need to draw on. She keyed the transfer now, routing the auxiliary magazine stock up through a manual conveyor that groaned like something waking from a long sleep, and told Priya with as much calm as she could put into 6 words, "Don't stop shooting. Help's coming up the shaft." "Boone, I could kiss you," Priya said, and then didn't have breath left over for anything but firing, because the conveyor's arrival bought the molar 4 more minutes of full-rate fire exactly when 4 more minutes mattered most. Aboard the Unbroken, the reserve wing's own casualty telemetry began arriving in a stream that no longer resembled anything in Kallavan's 3,000 campaigns of experience. Walkers that should have crested the ridge's final approach within minutes were instead burning in the talus, in the drainage cut, on the slope the Empire's own map still labeled, incorrectly, as soft ground. Gunships that should have owned the airspace over the ridge unopposed were falling to point defense fire from batteries that, by every model the Empire trusted, should have run dry of both power and ammunition an hour ago. "Fleet Admiral," said the officer running fleet logistics, in the particular careful tone reserved for numbers a superior did not want to hear. "Reserve wing losses are approaching 40% of committed strength. Recommend partial withdrawal to preserve remaining assets for a second, better prepared assault." Kallavan considered this for exactly as long as it took to remember that a second assault, launched after totality had already failed to arrive on schedule, would not be recorded in imperial doctrine as prudence. It would be recorded as the moment the Ninth Reclamation Fleet publicly failed to reclaim anything at all, in full view of the entire fleet's own sensor net, which, as was custom, as was tradition, as was meant to remind every crew in the Empire that the thrones did not fail, was broadcasting this campaign lived to every hull under his command. "No withdrawal," Kallavan said. "We finish what we started, or every ship in this fleet watches us fail to. There is no version of this where we quietly reconsider." He did not say the rest of the thought, the part that had begun, in the last 40 minutes, to feel less like a passing itch and more like a fact he did not yet have the vocabulary to hold. That he had spent 3,000 campaigns believing a defense without a single throat to cut was not a defense at all, and that he was watching, in real time, the specific and total falsification of that belief, on a mountain built by people who had apparently spent decades preparing for exactly the kind of admiral he was. 41 minutes to totality. Adjutant Vantrell's log, by now, no longer resembled the clean tactical record she had kept for 41 prior worlds. It had become something closer to a testimony, written in real time by a woman watching an institution's certainty come apart one revised projection at a time, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not want to stop watching. She wanted very badly to understand how a species with no empire, no standard reclamation model, no 3,000 years of doctrine, had built something that could do this to a fleet that had never lost. Inside the ridge, Reya Boone watched the auxiliary magazine stock fall past half, then past a third, and did the only math that mattered anymore. Not whether the ammunition would last until totality, but whether it would last long enough, and whether that was, in fact, the same question. She had stopped being able to feel her hands somewhere in the last hour. She kept them on the switches anyway. 31 minutes, Owen said from the comms table, and this time his voice did shake just slightly on the number, because 31 minutes had started to feel, for the first time all day, like a distance that might actually be crossed. It did not stay that way. Kallavan's next order arrived on the ridge as a single, undebatable fact. A targeted orbital strike, precision-guided rather than saturation, aimed not at the batteries but at the ridge's summit ridgeline itself, where the Ashford Line's primary optical relay stood in a reinforced cupola that had, until that moment, survived every prior exchange of the day. It was the kind of strike a fleet admiral ordered only when he had stopped trying to win efficiently and started trying to win at all, and it worked exactly as intended. The relay went down in a column of white fire that Reya felt through the mountain's bones from 4 levels underground, and with it went the last piece of long-range spotting the surface batteries had left, the one advantage the copper spine's slow, human-voiced coordination had still managed to keep. For 11 seconds, nobody on Ashford Ridge could see past 400 meters. Corporal Faisal Idris dug into his observation slit on the north knuckle with a spotting scope that had survived on batteries and stubbornness alone, did not wait to be told what to do next. He climbed out of the slit, into open air raked by suppressive fire from 3 directions, and ran 40 meters along an exposed shoulder of rock to a secondary position that still had line of sight on the western approach. A position everyone on the mountain, including Idris himself, had always assumed was a spot you used once and did not survive using twice. "Correction coming," he said into the hard line, breathing hard, ignoring the round that took a chip out of the stone 18 inches from his head. "Grid 419, that's the last Walker column. They're bunching at the chokepoint because they think the relay going down bought them room to move fast. It didn't. Reya relayed the correction. Battery 6 fired it. The chokepoint the Empire had chosen to move fast through disappeared under a salvo that the mountain's builders had ranged. On paper, 20 years before any of the soldiers dying in it had been assigned to this campaign. Idris made it back to the observation slit. He would not talk about, for the rest of his life, how close he had come to not making it back, and nobody on Ashford Ridge ever asked him to. 22 minutes to totality. Aboard the Unbroken, the reserve wing's telemetry stream thinned to a trickle that told its own story without anyone having to summarize it for the Admiral. Of the wing committed at hour 4, less than half remained combat effective. The western approach, which the standard Reclamation model had projected as secured by the second hour, remained, after nearly 4, entirely in the hands of a defense that Kallavan's own doctrine insisted should no longer be capable of coordinated resistance. "Fleet Admiral," Vantrell said, very quietly, because some sentences did not deserve to be said loudly, "I don't think there is a version of the model that accounts for what they actually are." Kallavan looked at her for a long moment, not with anger which she had braced for, but with something that looked, disorientingly, like recognition. "No," he said, "I don't believe there is. I built that model on 3,000 worlds that broke when their center went dark. I did not build it on a world that never had one center to begin with." He turned back to the display, to the ridge that refused, minute by minute, to become the statistic he had promised his own command it would be. "Continue the assault. I will not be the Admiral who orders a retreat with 22 minutes left on a clock I set myself, but log everything. Every projection, every revision, every minute past the estimate. If I am wrong about what this world is, the fleet will need the record, and it will need it honest." 19 minutes to totality. Inside Capacitor House 2, the primary bank's charge gauge read 6%, and Reya Boone made a decision that no manual, no drill, and no dead man's careful engineering had ever explicitly told her to make. She diverted power from the tunnel network's remaining life support, from every corridor not actively occupied by a fighting position, from the mountain's own reserve heating, and fed every spare watt the Ashford Line possessed into the 2 guns still standing between the Empire and the summit. "It's going to get cold down here," she said into the internal line, to nobody and everybody, and nobody on that mountain, not one single person, told her to stop. At 26 minutes to totality, the southern scrubland went still in a way that felt, to Sofia Marsh, different from the stillness that had followed the first 2 engagements. Not a lull before a third attempt, but the particular quiet of an enemy that had stopped believing the gullet was worth the cost of a third attempt at all. Imperial dropships that had been holding in low orbit over the southern approach broke formation and redirected north and west, toward the ridge's main assault, and the scrubland beyond the defile's mouth emptied of everything but the wreckage the platoon had already made of it. "Ridge control, gullet actual," Sofia said, watching the withdrawal through Whitfield's scope because her own optics had taken a hit somewhere in the second engagement and never quite recovered. "I think they've written us off. Southern approach traffic is redirecting north. Can you confirm from the big board?" "Confirmed," Reya's voice came back, thinner now, stretched by 5 hours of a strain that showed in every word without ever once breaking. "Fleet's committing everything it's got left to the western approach and the summit. Whatever's happening up there in the next 20 minutes, it's happening with everything they have." Sofia looked at her platoon, 24 soldiers still standing out of 28, 4 wounded but alive under Duart's care, ammunition thin but not gone, a defile that had cost the Empire 2 full attempts and had not, in exchange, cost the Ashford Line the ground it was built to hold, and made the decision that no order from the spine had told her to make, because the spine had bigger problems in the next 20 minutes than one platoon commander's judgment call. "Prentice," Can the wounded hold the gullet with a skeleton crew if the south stays quiet? North wall's rubble, south wall's rubble, throats still choked with wreckage from that shield platform, Prentice said, already understanding where she was going before she finished asking. 4 people and a pair of coilguns could hold this ground against a company that's already been bled twice trying it. You're thinking about the summit. I'm thinking the fleet just told us, by leaving, that the fight that matters most in the next 20 minutes isn't happening here anymore, Sofia said. I'm thinking Priya Chen's crew is up there with rockets and no orders, and I'm thinking 24 soldiers who have spent 5 hours learning how to hold a line as a team might be worth more standing next to her than sitting down here guarding ground nobody's coming for. Prentice studied her for a moment that felt longer than it was, the particular assessing look of a man who had spent 4 decades deciding, over and over, whether a younger officer's instincts were worth following into the next bad idea. That's not in anybody's plan, he said. Neither was the gullet holding twice against better numbers than the plan accounted for, Sofia said. I'm not ordering anyone who's hurt or spent to move. Duarte, Reyes, and whoever else needs to stay, hold the throat. That's a real job and I need it done. Everybody else we're moving north, fast, along the service road. If the summit needs bodies in the next 20 minutes, I'd rather 24 of ours get there late than not try to get there at all. Duarte didn't argue because there wasn't time to and because she'd already reached the same conclusion Sofia had, watching the southern scrubland empty out in front of her. Go, she said. I've got 4 wounded and 2 coilguns and a defile that's already proven what it's built to do. You're not needed here anymore. Go be needed somewhere that still is. They moved north along the service road at a pace that had nothing left to give and gave it anyway. 24 exhausted soldiers who had spent 5 hours believing their fight was a sideshow to the real battle happening on the ridge's main faces. Discovering in the last 20 minutes of the day that no fight on Ashford Ridge had ever actually been a sideshow. Because every gun that held was 1 fewer gun, the fleet could use to concentrate everything it had left against whatever position it decided mattered most. Sofia Marsh ran at the head of her platoon with a body that had stopped, sometime in the last hour, telling her clearly whether it was exhausted or simply running on the certainty that stopping was not currently an option, and heard, as the service road crested the ridge's southern shoulder and gave her a clear line to the summit for the first time, the sound of an alarm she recognized from 100 drills and had never actually expected to hear outside one. The ridge-wide signal for a hostile force on the crown itself. That's the summit, Whitfield said beside her, breathing hard. That's the honor guard alarm. Then we run faster, Sofia said and did. 15 minutes to totality. The Empire threw the last thing it had left that could still be called a plan. Kallavan committed his own honor guard, a company of veteran soldiers normally held in reserve for the Unbroken's personal defense, elite past anything the reserve wing had fielded, dropped in a single precision insertion meant to reach the ridge's summit directly, and plant an imperial standard within sight of every camera in the fleet before the clock ran out, because a fleet admiral who could not deliver totality on schedule could, at minimum, deliver the appearance of it. They came down fast and quiet, avoiding the pre-sighted kill zones by dropping directly onto the ridge's exposed crown rather than approaching through the valleys the defense had spent 2 generations preparing for, and for 90 seconds it worked. 12 soldiers reached the summit. One of them unfurled the standard. For those 90 seconds, the crown of Ashford Ridge belonged to the Empire in a way no other square meter of the mountain had all day. The honor guard moved with a precision that made the reserve wing's earlier assault look amateurish by comparison. Veteran soldiers who had spent their careers guarding a fleet admiral rather than fighting a war, drilled to a standard the 9th Reclamation Fleet reserved for exactly 1 company in its entire order of battle, and it showed in the way they secured the crown's 4 approaches within the first 20 seconds. In the way, the officer carrying the standard never once broke stride, even as the mountain's remaining point defense turrets, starved of power and ammunition, tried and failed to bring enough guns to bear on a position that had never been meant to hold against an assault from directly above. Corporal Faisal Idris saw them first from his observation slit, and understood, with a clarity that came only from 5 hours of watching this exact mountain refuse to fall, that he was looking at the one imperial objective all day actually built to succeed on schedule. He had no rockets, no clear shot, nothing but a spotting scope and a voice, and he used the only weapon he had left. All positions, this is North Knuckle. The crown is compromised. I say again, hostiles on the summit with a standard. Does anybody have anything that can reach them? Nobody answered for 4 full seconds, because everybody with anything left to answer with was already spending it on the western approach, and those 4 seconds were the longest of Idris's day, longer than the run along the exposed shoulder, longer than the round that had taken a chip out of the stone by his head, because for the first time since totality had been declared, he understood exactly what it would look like if the mountain lost. Not a collapse, not a breach. Just a flag going up on a crown that the entire fleet was watching. A single photogenic image that would outlive every gun the Ashford Line had fired that day, and rewrite what totality had actually meant. Sergeant Reya Boone, out of ammunition at the molar and refusing on principle to consider that a reason to stop fighting, had already abandoned the gun pit with 4 of her crew, and a case of shoulder-fired rockets meant for exactly the kind of emergency nobody had wanted to name out loud. They reached the summit's approach with 90 seconds to spare and no orders telling them to be there, and found they were not the only ones who had made that particular decision without waiting for permission. Lieutenant Sofia Marsh's platoon came up the service road from the south within the same handful of seconds, 24 soldiers who had spent the morning proving a chokepoint 6 kilometers away, and arrived at the summit with exactly as little breath left as Reya's crew and exactly as much intention of using what remained of it. The mountain's discipline had never required orders for this. It required only that everyone on it understood, without being told, what needed doing when the plan ran out. There was no time to coordinate a plan beyond the one both groups arrived with independently and discovered, in the same half-second, that they shared. Hit the crown from 2 directions at once before the honor guard could consolidate a defensive perimeter around the standard. Reya's crew came up the eastern face with their rockets. Marsh's platoon came up the western shoulder with whatever ammunition Prentice and Osai had left in their belts, and the honor guard, elite, disciplined, and utterly unprepared to be the ones on the receiving end of a pincer on ground they had been told was already secured, found itself fighting in 2 directions with a standard-bearer who could not, by the honor guard's own doctrine, be permitted to drop the flag to pick up a weapon. Whitfield went down flat behind a boulder 8 meters from the nearest honor guard soldier and put 3 rounds into a gap in the man's shoulder, plating that he would not, for years afterward, be able to explain how he'd seen. Prentice took a graze across the ribs that he would not report to Duarte until the following morning, on the grounds that reporting it in the moment would only have gotten him ordered to sit down, and 61-year-old sergeants who had spent 4 decades holding chokepoints did not sit down in the middle of the one fight that mattered most. The standard came down 20 seconds after it went up. So did the honor guard's ranking officer and 8 of the 11 soldiers with him. Reya took a wound to the leg that would end her career in that uniform and did not, in the moment, notice she had it. 600 kilometers below the fleet, in a town called Millbrook that had no batteries, no coilgun nests, and no part in the Ashford Line's chain of command beyond the accident of sitting 19 kilometers from the ridge's eastern face. The imperial countdown had been playing since hour 5 on every public screen the evacuation authority hadn't managed to black out. The same clean, unencrypted signal Owen Ape had flagged in Capacitor House 2 that morning, broadcast, as the fleet intended. to remind every human being watching exactly how the day was supposed to end. A girl named Priya, no relation to Sergeant Chen, a coincidence nobody in Millbrook would learn about for months, stood in the town's transit shelter with her grandfather's hand wrapped around hers, and watched the same feed the entire empire was watching, because the fleet's arrogance had never once considered that broadcasting its own inevitability to the world, it meant to conquer might backfire on a species that had spent its whole history refusing to look away from bad news. She was 11 years old, and she had spent the last 5 hours doing the thing every child in Millbrook's shelter had been doing since the countdown began, watching the number, and watching the adults' faces for the moment the adults stopped believing it, because children always knew before anyone told them. Her grandfather, a retired surveyor named Robert Anholt, who had, as it happened, worked 2 summers on the Ashford Ridge project as a young man and never told his granddaughter exactly what he'd helped build, had not stopped believing. Not once. Not when the sky went white at hour 4, not when the jamming barrage dropped every screen in the shelter to static for 6 minutes, not when the honor guard standard went up on the crown and half the shelter gasped as one. "It's going to come down," he said quietly to nobody but her, when the standard rose gold and black against the smoke-streaked sky on the public feed. "How do you know?" Priya asked. "Because I know who's still standing under it," he said, and did not explain further because there was no time to, and because the standard came down on the screen exactly as he'd said it would, 20 seconds after it went up, and the shelter erupted into a sound that was not quite cheering. It was too exhausted, too disbelieving, too aware that the day was not yet over but was not silence either, the sound of several hundred people who had spent 5 hours being told, on good authority, from orbit, exactly how afraid they were supposed to be, discovering all at once that the authority had been wrong. It was happening in shelters and transit hubs and quiet kitchens on every continent that could still receive a signal, the same discovery arriving at slightly different moments depending on the delay of whatever relay carried it, but arriving everywhere eventually, because the Empire's own custom, broadcast the countdown, let the whole world watch its own ending arrive on schedule, had never once been built with a contingency for a defense that simply declined to lose on schedule. And every screen carrying that refusal now carried it to the people it had been meant to frighten, instead of only to the fleet it had been meant to reassure. Aboard the Unbroken, the feed broadcasting to the entire fleet showed, in real time, an Imperial honor guard standard rising over a mountain that every sensor the Empire owned still insisted should have fallen hours earlier, and then showed it fall, and showed the mountain still standing, still firing, still exactly as unconquered as it had been 5 hours before, in front of every crew on every hull under Kallavan's command. 9 minutes to totality. Nobody on the Ashford Line had ammunition left to spare, power left to spend, or a plan left in reserve. What they had, dug into 600 feet of granite by 2 generations of people who had never expected gratitude, and had built the mountain anyway, was enough guns still standing to make the last 9 minutes as expensive as the first 3 hours had been, and a discipline that did not know how to recognize the moment it was supposed to quit. Reya Boone kept both hands on the switches her grandfather had built, watched the last full percentage points of Capacitor House 2's reserve bleed away into 2 guns that would not, could not, stop firing, and did not let herself hope, because hope, she had learned somewhere in the last 4 hours and 51 minutes, was a thing you could not afford to feel until the clock actually said you'd earned it. 4 minutes. The last Imperial push broke against the western approach the way every wave before it had broken, not because the ridge had anything left that felt, from the inside, like strength, but because it had discipline, and discipline did not need strength to keep functioning. It needed only people willing to keep doing the job in front of them for 1 more minute, and then the minute after that. 2 minutes. Colonel Halvorson, gray-faced and upright through nothing but refusal, keyed the command net one last time before totality and said the only thing he had left to say, in a voice that had gone hoarse but had never once, across 5 hours, gone unsteady. All positions. Whatever happens in the next 120 seconds, you already won the part that mattered. Hold. 0. The clock on the wall of capacitor house 2 read 0 hours, 0 minutes, and it was still not Earth's clock. And for the first time since the fleet had begun broadcasting it, Reya Boone let herself look directly at the number instead of past it. Nothing happened. That was the entire, enormous fact of it. No new wave came. No final order arrived from orbit demanding one more push past the deadline the Empire itself had set and broadcast to its own fleet as an article of faith. The guns above the mountain, for the first time in 5 hours, had nothing left in range to fire at, and the silence that followed was so complete that Owen Ake, at the comms table, found he did not know what to say into it. Totality, Reya said finally to the empty capacitor house, to a mountain her grandfather had built and never lived to see hold, to nobody who could hear her but herself. Totality was 5 hours ago. It's still hours. 600 kilometers overhead, the silence on the Unbroken's command deck was of an entirely different character. Every officer in the amphitheater had been watching the same sensor feed Kallavan had, the same feed that had been relayed, by ancient and unbroken custom, to every ship in the 9th Reclamation fleet. 900 hulls, tens of thousands of crew, all of them watching in real time as the countdown their fleet admiral had set with his own voice reached 0, and the mountain beneath it kept standing, kept firing, kept refusing with a patience that had outlasted everything the Empire had thrown at it. The custom existed because the throne wanted every crew in the fleet to witness its inevitability, over and over, world after world, until victory felt less like an event than a law of nature. Nobody who had built that custom had ever imagined it would one day broadcast the opposite lesson to the same audience, in the same format, with the same unedited clarity. Adjutant Vantrell watched Kallavan stand very still in front of the dead countdown, the number 00, 00, 00 hanging in the air above a continent that had not fallen, and understood that she was watching a man do something almost nobody in imperial service had ever been required to do in front of witnesses. Recalculate in public from 0. Cease offensive operations, Kallavan said. His voice, when it came, was quieter than it had been at any point in the last 5 hours, but it did not waver, and Vantrell found, to her own surprise, that she respected him more in that moment than she had at the confident start of the briefing. Recover what personnel we can. Withdraw the reserve wing to orbital staging. He turned to face the amphitheater fully 200 officers who had watched their own doctrine fail in real time and did not yet know what they were permitted to feel about it. The standard reclamation model assumes a defense collapses once its coordination is destroyed. This world's coordination was never in one place to destroy. It was distributed into every soldier holding a line, trained to act without being told, prepared decades in advance by people who assumed help might never come and built accordingly. That is not an anomaly I will paper over in the record. I gave this campaign a number. The number was wrong. I would rather the entire fleet know exactly how wrong than pretend, for the sake of my own comfort, that it was close. He ordered the full sensor logs, unedited, uncompressed, including his own revised projections, and the moment his honor guard standard fell, transmitted to every hull in the fleet and appended, under his own authorization code, to the 9th Reclamation Fleet's official record, a record that would outlive his command and travel, eventually, to every archive the throne maintained. It was not an apology. Kallavan did not believe in apologies. He believed, with the same rigor he had once believed in his model, that an honest failure recorded in full was worth more to the Empire than a comfortable one buried in summary. But every officer who watched that transmission go out understood it for what it was. The first time in living memory that a fleet admiral had let the whole of the Empire watch him be wrong. Adjutant Sarai Vantral closed her tactical log that evening, standard reckoning, ship's time, 6 hours after a totality that had never technically arrived, and found she could not make herself write the ordinary closing entry, the brief administrative note that ended every campaign log she had ever kept, objective secured. She sat with the log open for a long time, in a cabin barely large enough for the bunk and the desk, and eventually wrote instead a single line that she would carry, unofficially, for the rest of a career that would take her, decades later, to a seat on the same War College review board that had once required Kallavan's honest report as mandatory study. They did not win because they had more. They won because losing was never a decision any of them were willing to make one at a time. She did not know, writing it, that it would become the line every cadet in her own future lecture hall would be made to copy out by hand, or that she would spend the back half of her career arguing, against considerable institutional resistance, that the standard reclamation model be retired rather than merely revised, on the grounds that any model built to measure a species' will to resist by counting its guns had already misunderstood the only variable that mattered. She would not fully win that argument in her lifetime. She would move the number further than anyone expected a Threndeli adjutant 3 years out of the academy to move it, and she would always say, when asked how she'd started, that she had simply been in the room the day a number everyone trusted turned out to be wrong, and had decided that pretending otherwise afterward was a worse mistake than the number itself had been. Inside the ridge, the accounting began the way it always began after a fight this size, quietly, methodically, by people too tired to feel anything as clean as triumph. Colonel Halvorsen was carried to the surface on a stretcher, conscious, arguing with the medics the entire way about whether he was allowed to walk, and losing that argument for the first time all day. Sergeant Priya Chen sat propped against the molar's cold barrel with a field dressing on her leg and watched the sky, empty now of anything that wanted to kill her, with an expression that hadn't decided yet whether it was relief or disbelief. Corporal Faisal Idris climbed down from his observation slit for the last time, and did not, for several minutes, manage to make his hands stop shaking. South of the summit, in a defile that had spent the war's final hour empty of everything but 2 coil guns and 4 soldiers too wounded to run north with the rest of their platoon, Corporal Inez Duarte sat against the second barricade with Private Reyes Colin's head in her lap, and listened to the ridge-wide channel go quiet the way every other channel on the mountain had, and understood, before anyone confirmed it over the hardline, that the fight was over. Because the particular silence that followed totality did not sound like anything else that had happened that day. "We held it," Reyes Colin said, more to himself than to her, his voice thick with blood loss and the particular disbelief of a 19-year-old private who had genuinely not been certain, at several points that morning, that he would be alive to say it. "The gullet. We actually held it." "You held it," Duarte said. "I mostly just kept you from bleeding on the parts that were still holding it." She checked his pulse again out of the same habit that had kept her hands busy for 5 straight hours, found it steady, and allowed herself, for the first time since the barrage began, to stop checking anything at all. Sofia Marsh came back down the service road an hour after totality with what remained of her platoon, 23 of the 24 who had run north, one left behind at the summit with a wound that would keep him there until a proper evacuation could reach him, and found the gullet exactly as she had left it, cratered, scorched, choked with wreckage on both approaches, and still, unmistakably, held. She stood a long moment at the mouth of the defile that had cost the Empire 2 full attempts and had not once, across 5 hours, given up the ground it was built to protect, and thought about the version of that morning where she had ordered a retreat the instant the numbers stopped looking survivable, because there had been at least one moment, watching the shield platforms grind toward the throat, where that order had genuinely occurred to her. "You didn't give it," Prentice said, reading the thought off her face with the same ease he read everything else. That's the only part that ever actually matters. I almost did. Almost doesn't hold a chokepoint, LT. Didn't does. He looked down the length of the defile, at the two coilgun nests still manned, at Duarte still working on Ray's Colin's leg with the same unhurried focus she'd shown since dawn, at 28 soldiers, 28 still, every one of them, whatever it had cost to keep that number whole, who had spent the worst day of their lives proving that a 4-meter gap in a granite wall could be worth more than every shield platform the Empire owned. Whoever built this place knew something, not magic. Just knew that the day would come, and knew it'd need people who wouldn't leave, and built the ground to make that easier than leaving would have been. Sofia thought about Silas Boone, a man she had never met and would never meet, who had stood exactly where she was standing now, decades before any of this had a date, and decided that a granite throat on the southern shoulder of a mountain nobody had attacked yet was worth blasting wider and walling with rebar on the strength of nothing, but the conviction that someone, someday, would need it to hold. She did not know his name. Nobody in the gullet did that day. The credit for the mountain's design had settled, in the garrison's memory, into the Ashford Line generally rather than any one engineer specifically. But she understood, standing in the wreckage of a fight that had not cost her platoon a single life, exactly what Reya Boone would come to understand in her own quieter way over the years that followed, that the mountain had never been the whole answer. It had only ever been the thing that made the people who came after able to give one. Reya Boone stayed at the panel a long time after the guns went quiet, one hand resting on the brass toggle switches her grandfather had installed decades before an empire had ever known Earth's coordinates, and did the only thing that felt honest in that particular silence. She read the names, out loud, of the two people the mountain had cost that day, because somebody had to be the one to say them first, and it seemed wrong to let a machine do it. Word of the gullet reached Capacitor House 2 properly for the first time that evening, in the unhurried way good news traveled on a mountain too tired to celebrate anything loudly. A runner, then a hardline call, then Reya hearing, second-hand, that a platoon she had spoken to only twice all day, briefly, over a line she'd half expected to go silent by hour 2, had held a chokepoint 6 kilometers south without losing a single soldier to it. She thought about Sofia Marsh's voice on that first call, steady and a little wry, good lucks for people who don't have a plan, and found herself smiling for what she realized, checking the sensation with some surprise, was the first time since the countdown had started. The Empire did not return to Ashford Ridge. It withdrew the 9th Reclamation Fleet to a distant holding pattern within the week, officially to reassess terrain-adaptive defense doctrine across all future campaigns, unofficially because no admiral in the fleet wanted to be the second officer whose failure the throne watched live. Kallavan's amended report, the full one, the honest one with every wrong projection left uncut, reached the Imperial War College 11 months later and became, against every institutional instinct that normally buried such things, required study for every officer cadet training in siege doctrine. It did not use the word defeat. It did not need to. It simply reproduced, in full, the countdown clock's final reading beside the sensor image of a mountain still standing, still armed, still exactly where it had always been, and let the two facts sit next to each other without comment, because by then even the Empire had learned that some numbers argued for themselves. The broadcast had not stayed confined to the 9th Reclamation Fleet. Imperial custom required the countdown be relayed, unedited, to the tribute worlds nearest the current campaign, a standing propaganda function, decades old, meant to remind every subjugated system in range exactly what happened to species that resisted, and the relay routers along the Ashford campaign's transmission corridor had done their job with the same blind competence that had done Kallavan no favors all afternoon. On a mining colony 3 systems away, on a world the Empire had reclaimed so thoroughly 2 generations earlier that its people no longer remembered the word for what they'd been before, A maintenance foreman named Yethkorvali stood in a public concourse with several hundred other tribute world laborers, watching a screen that had shown them, for as long as anyone could remember, only the Empire's victories, and watched, for the first time in the concourse's history. A countdown reached 0, with the promised world still standing beneath it. Nobody in the concourse cheered. Cheering was not a thing tribute world laborers did in public, not with imperial administrators watching the same feed from the gallery above, and Corvallis had lived under occupation long enough to know exactly how much that silence cost everyone holding it. But he noticed, in the days that followed, a change in the concourse he could not have named before he saw it. People held eye contact a half-second longer than they used to. Conversations that would have ended at the mention of Earth now continued, quietly, in doorways, in ways that administrators would eventually notice and could not entirely stop, because a fact once broadcast to an entire tribute network could not be unbroadcast, and the Empire's own transmission logs, the same logs Kallavan had ordered kept honest, meant that no local governor could quietly claim the campaign had gone as planned without every laborer in the concourse knowing, from the throne's own unedited feed, that it hadn't. It was a small thing. Nobody on Ashford Ridge would ever hear about Yethkorvallis, and Yethkorvallis would never learn the names Reya Boone or Sofia Marsh or Priya Chen, and the mining colony's occupation did not end that year, or the year after. But the Empire had built its entire propaganda architecture on the assumption that broadcasting its own inevitability, over and over, to worlds it already controlled, would keep those worlds believing resistance was pointless before the thought could fully form. It had never once built a contingency for what happened when the same architecture, on a single afternoon, carried the opposite lesson at exactly the same volume, to every audience it had ever been designed to reach. Kallavan's honest report reached the Imperial War College 11 months later. The unedited footage of the countdown reaching 0 over an unconquered mountain had already reached a great many people the War College would never think to survey, and it kept reaching them relay by relay, for as long as anyone bothered to keep the recording. Reya Boone stayed on at Ashford Ridge after the war moved elsewhere, first as an engineer, eventually as the officer who trained the next generation of crews on a system her grandfather had built, and she had kept alive with her own hands through the 5 worst hours of her life. She never gave speeches about it. When new recruits asked her, inevitably, how she'd known the old copper system would hold when the Network 1 failed, she told them the truth, every time, in the same flat, unhurried voice the mountain itself seemed to have taught her. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck. Somebody had built it to last, decades before anyone needed it to, on the simple and unglamorous conviction that the people who came after would still be standing here, still fighting, still worth preparing for. All she had done was keep her hands on the switches until the clock ran out, and be exactly as stubborn, for exactly as long, as the mountain had already promised the Empire she would be.